supposedly true story is told that some years ago, the great Albert Einstein was going on a train to an out-of-town engagement. And as he sat in his seat, the conductor stopped by to check his ticket. The great scientist, however, preoccupied with his work and somewhat flustered, with great embarrassment, rummaged through his coat pockets and briefcase, all to no avail. He could not find his ticket. The conductor said, "Dr. Einstein, we all know who you are. I'm sure you bought a ticket. Don't worry about it. Everything's okay." The conductor then walked on down the aisle, checking other tickets. But before he moved to the next car, he looked back and saw Dr. Einstein, now down on his hands and knees, looking under his seat. It seems desperately trying to find his ticket. The conductor walked back and gently said, "Dr. Einstein, please don't worry about it. It's okay. I know who you are." To which it is said, Einstein looked up and replied, "Young man, you don't understand. It's not okay. Without that ticket, I too know who I am. What I don't know is where I'm going." Sometimes even the brightest of people need help finding their way. And this is something of what I'd like to discuss this morning. Finding your way through life. Today in our ongoing look at the 23rd Psalm, we consider the second of the descriptive phrases in the Psalm that explores the nature of God's care for us. How with the Lord as our shepherd we shall not want. Our main text today being, "He leadeth me beside the still waters." Now, as we noted last week, this phrase, along with the first, "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," describes both God's provision of our basic physical needs, in this case water, but also God's gift of inner peace and serenity, still water. However, along with this, the second phrase also introduces a new idea, a new theme that will continue to show up throughout the rest of the psalm, namely the gift of guidance or direction. The idea of being led by the shepherd. "He leadeth thee." An idea repeated in the fourth phrase, which will also be part of our discussion this morning. "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." The idea of being led by God, a repeated theme in this great text. Why? Well, as we observed at the outset of the series, sheep have a very poor sense of direction. They are very prone to getting lost and thus getting into all sorts of trouble. And this is particularly important, as the psalmist first emphasizes here, in regard to their need for water. Sheep, if thirsty, will drink out of anything, out of any rancid pool, becoming very ill. And thus one of the major tasks of the shepherd is finding good watering sources for his flock and to lead them to these places, something sheep can't do on their own. And this, I believe, is the next major theme this great psalm is trying to present us with, that like sheep, on our own, we can't find our way. We get easily lost, and so often we wind up drinking from rancid pools and getting sick. But if we put the Lord in charge of our lives, he will lead us to good, healthy places onto life. The question, of course, being, how does God do this? How does God seek to lead us through life? I mean, don't we all have those times when we're desperately seeking God's direction? We wish to, say like on our phones, we had some sort of spiritual GPS or something, a God positioning system, if you will, that we could call up and find our way. Well, how do we take hold of the guidance of God that the psalm promises? Well, this is what I'd like to offer. I'd like to offer a few thoughts on this. 3 suggestions to opening yourself to God's leading, to breaking free of always wandering through life, trying to find your own way and struggling, but to instead discover God's leading you into life. Suggestion number 1, put God in front. Obviously, the first most fundamental component of being led is that the leader needs to be out in front with those who follow behind him. That's the general arrangement of things. Basically, being led by someone whose way back behind you doesn't quite work out. And this, you see, is the first major lesson we get here, that to be led by God through life, into life, God has to be out in front of us and not behind us. And plainly stated, our lives so often get so messed up, we get so lost in places we should never be because we do just the opposite. We put God behind us. We go in front. We go about our way, and then we ask God to follow up after us and clean up, right? You know? It's like comedian Fred Allen used to say, most people spend all week sowing their wild oats and then go to church on Sunday to pray for a crop failure. We go along, we go our own way, and then when we get in trouble, only when we get in trouble, we want God to come along and fix everything. We put ourselves out in front, not the Lord, and that's why we have so much trouble. Basically, the first step in being led by God is putting God in front of our lives. And that means in everything. Everything we do. Everywhere we go. To think about God first. To consider God first. To check in with God first. Not afterwards. God in front. God leading, not following. It's like I remember once hearing about this famous preacher who, before everything he would do, he would always say a very quick prayer. It's very easy. He would always say a quick prayer. For instance, something as simple and ordinary as answering the phone. Before picking up the phone, he would quickly say, Lord, give me the words you want me to say to this person. Always putting God first. God leading, not following. One author puts it this way. In a most difficult time in my life, as I was seeking God's direction, I stopped and meditated. And as I meditated on the word guidance, I kept seeing the word dance at the end of the word. I remember reading that doing God's will is a lot like dancing. When two people try to lead, nothing feels right. The movement doesn't flow with the music and everything is quite uncomfortable and awkward. When one person relaxes and lets the other lead, however, both bodies begin to flow with the music. One gives gentle cues, perhaps with a nudge to the back or by pressing lightly in one direction or another. It's as if two become one body, moving beautifully. The dance takes surrender, willingness, and attentiveness from one person, and gentle guidance and skill from the other. My eyes drew back to the word guidance. When I saw the first letter, G, I thought of God, followed by you and I. God, you and I, dance. This is what guidance means to me. To find my way, I must trust God's direction and be willing to let God lead. Is God leading you in your dance of life? Is God in front of your life, always bringing up the rear? Do you go to God first in everything or last, only as a last resort when you've loused everything up? Suggestion number one in finding God's guidance in your life, put God in front. Suggestion number two then, respond to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. As we consider the idea of being led by God, another thing that I believe is important to note is that in this, God is continually reaching out to us and communicating to us, to speak to us and to direct us. God does this in all sorts of ways. There's no one set means of communication. Sometimes God speaks to us through Scripture, sometimes through the words of the people around us, sometimes through prayer and meditation, sometimes moments of worship or beauty or dreams or visions. Whatever, God is always talking to us, to each of us, not just to special, spiritual people. But God is always speaking to us, seeking to offer words of guidance and direction in our day. The next key question being, are we listening for this? There's a story that's told of a mountain man, a guy who lived in the wilderness, far away from civilization, who one day came to visit a friend who lived in New York City. He met his friend in the city, and the two were walking near Times Square. The streets, as always, were filled with people. Cars were honking their horns. Taxi cabs were squealing around corners. Sirens were wailing. Suddenly, the mountain man stops and says, I hear a cricket. His friend is astounded. But you gotta be crazy. You couldn't possibly hear a cricket in all of this noise. No, I'm sure of it, the mountain man says. I heard a cricket. That's crazy, replies the friend. At that, the mountain man listened carefully for a moment and then walked across the street to where there was just some little shrubs growing. He looked into the bushes and sure enough, he located a small cricket. His friend was utterly amazed. That's incredible, he told his friend. You must have superhuman ears. No, said the mountain man, my ears are no different from yours. But that can't be, said the friend. I could never hear a cricket and all that noise. Yes, you could, came the reply. Here, let me show you how. And the mountain man reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and dropped them on the sidewalk. And with that, amidst the noise of the crowded street still blaring in their ears, they noticed that every head within 20 feet turned to look to see if the money that had just fallen was theirs. See what I mean? Asked the mountain man. It all depends on what's important to you and what you're listening for. The voice of God is out there. Are we listening for it? Are we attentive to it? Returning to the imagery of the psalm, it's a well-documented fact that sheep can recognize their master's voice and differentiate it from others' voices. They listen for it and they only answer to it. How about us? Second component of being led by God is understanding that God is always talking to us, always trying to direct us, but we have to be listening for it. And obviously the first way we listen for it and hear the voice of God is through the spiritual disciplines we looked at last week, prayer and Scripture, in which I would just note that the goal is not to get answers, but rather to create a relationship in which we learn to recognize God's voice. But even more, the way we come to discern God's voice in our lives, to hear it amidst the many voices calling out to us daily, is by asking constantly, does this word that I hear fit with what I know of God's love in Jesus Christ? But most of all in all of this, the point then ultimately being not just to listen, not just to hear, but to actually discern, but and to respond to what has been heard, to actually go and do, to follow. That is, in being led, we first, as just noted, we need a leader, but then secondly, we need to follow. To follow, which is, of course, not a noun, but a verb. It's an action word. Think of it this way. It's demonstrated time and time again throughout the Bible, as well as in the lives of so many people of faith down through the centuries. God generally does not show the whole path that He is trying to lead us to. Rather, God generally just shows us one step at a time. And part of this is because of the mysterious ways of God. Part of it is because often if God were to show us the whole path, where He's really trying to take us, we wouldn't go, It's not what we're looking for. It's scary. But whatever the point is, that due to our weakness and God's perfect wisdom and compassion, God only gives us one step at a time. And the trick for us then is to be continually listening for the next step and then taking that one step. That is, through the Holy Spirit, God is continually prompting us with a nudge here, a word in our hearts there, calling us, inviting us, encouraging us to go where God would perhaps like us to be, to do something that the Lord wants done, to be part of what God is about. We all feel such things at times, and the more we seek them, tune into them, through the methods previously mentioned, the more we hear them. We hear that little word. Speak to that person over there. Reach out to that individual in need. Get involved in that cause. Haven't we all felt those little nudges in our hearts? But when you filter them through how they can fit with the love of God in Jesus Christ and then act on them, amazing things happen. It's like, haven't you ever had those moments when something out of the blue just says to you, call so-and-so, right? Maybe somebody you haven't talked to in a long time or maybe even thought about in years. But you make the call, and what invariably happens? Something amazing, right? You get a God moment. Either you offer them something they desperately needed right at that moment, or they do the same for you. It's amazing things. It's finding our way. Well, the problem is that we tend to get so hung up on demanding that God give us the whole map for our lives laid out up front that we end up losing sight of this, and thus we lose our way. When the fact is that if we'll just take little baby steps, the little baby steps God's calling us to each day, we'll find our whole way. We'll eventually don't get the whole trip. That's all that is needed. For as we take each step, only as we take each step, in obedience to what we believe the Lord is asking of us, God reveals the next step. As the great C.S. Lewis once said, a glimpse of the next 3 feet of road is often far more important and useful than a view of the horizon. Second great lesson here, listen for the little promptings of the Holy Spirit, just another single step in your life in the Lord, and then take that step. That's all you need to do, and you'll find your whole way. One author writes, there once was a little boy who on his way home from school one day arrived late at a busy pedestrian crossing and found it unattended. The usual crossing guard was not present, and the boy was frightened. Seeing him standing nervously at the edge of the curb, several cars pulled up and stopped for him, but he still hesitated to cross such a wide road by himself. Well, the 4th car in line was a police car with a loudspeaker attached. The policeman saw the little boy hesitating at the curb, and so he flicked the switch and said in a loud voice through the car's microphone, "The boy at the curb can cross now." Slightly bewildered, the boy looked all around, unsure where the voice had come from. But eventually he ran across the street. When he got home, his mother asked him how his day had gone. He said, "All right," reaching for an apple. "But when I got to the crossing, no one was there, Mom. I was so scared. Luckily, though, God suddenly spoke to me and told me that I could cross." You see, that's how he interpreted things. And he was a smart kid. God is speaking. Are we expecting it? Are we listening for it? Are we responding to it? Listen and take that next step. It has been said, God's will is not an itinerary, but an attitude. Suggestion number 2 in finding God's guidance in your life, respond to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. And then finally, suggestion number 3, remember that God is ultimately leading you to Himself. As mentioned, there is a second phrase in the psalm that refers to God's guidance. Along with He leadeth me beside the still waters, we are also told He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Now in this, the author obviously lets go of the strict sheep-shepherd imagery for a moment to instead make a point that is somewhat beyond the metaphor. And notice what he tells us. First he says that God leads us in the paths of righteousness. That is literally in right paths. Now think about that for a moment. If there are right paths, what must there also be? Wrong paths, right. And this, you see, sets up the foundation of our final point here. This sharp contrast, this confrontation, if you will. Right way versus wrong way. Basically, what we are being told that as God leads us through life, God particularly, obviously, will only lead us to what is right, what is in accordance with his will. The inference being that there are all these other options, these other paths that we might take, some of them not quite so right, some of them downright wrong, but paths that many, including ourselves, often take. Why? Because they're easy, they're desirable, they're more immediately beneficial. It's a reminder to us that following God's direction is often difficult and challenging and costly, frequently going against our natural inclination. But that particularly if we are following God's guidance, we must be a people who refuse the easy, natural, wrongful ways of this world and instead embody and enact what the world could and should be. A people who thus will often stand out as those who take a very different way. That is, at one level, this line is a reminder to us, specifically as followers of Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd, that we should stand out as different and better than the world around us. It asks of us, as we have noted many times in the past, do our lives show a better way of living? Do our lives continually demonstrate the way we know life can and should be in Jesus Christ? Or do we merely reflect how things already are? When people meet us, do they see a whole better world? When people come to our church, when they come to St. John's, do they discover a whole better way of living? Or just the same stuff they discover everywhere else? Same old, same old. It's like, have you ever heard the story of the two men who met on the street one day? One said to the other, have you heard about Harry? He embezzled the company out of $500,000. The other man said, that's terrible. We never did trust Harry. The first man said, not only that, Harry left town and he took Tom's wife with him. The other man said, that's awful. Harry always has been a ne'er-do-well. The first man said, not only that, he stole a car to make his getaway. The other man said, that's scandalous. I always did think Harry had a bad streak in him. First man said, not only that, they said he was drunk as he pulled out of town.
No, not Harry.
Yeah, not Harry. The other man said, Harry is just no good. But what really bothers me is this. Who are we going to get to teach his Sunday school class at church this week? How often are we here just like everybody else out there? Like the rest of the world when we should be different? God's leading is in the paths of righteousness that is always only towards what is right and good in a world that is far too often otherwise. And if for whatever reason we won't accept this, we then lose out on the guidance. We can't be led. We should be taking a different path. But even further, notice what the psalmist then finally adds on to this. He says, he leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. That is, the author is telling us this guidance of us into the right path, into what is right, different from the norm, is ultimately not simply so that we can stand out as different, not simply so that we might confront some wrong, not simply for our own personal spiritual benefit somehow, but rather for the purpose, the text tells us, as to draw attention to God, to point people to God, for his name's sake. That is, specifically, to make God look good, to give glory to God, to draw people to God. And putting this all together, this is our final lesson in all of this. That God's guidance of our lives has two main components to it. Part of it is his directing us to what we need, to what is a personal blessing to us. He leadeth me beside the still waters. But also there is this component outside of ourselves, something seemingly not of immediate need to us, namely his larger work beyond us, his saving work of drawing all people unto himself, of which we are also a part. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Personal blessing and larger work. The point being that the psalmist combines these two here, and thus the two are one. That's how God directs us God directs us to what we individually need is by calling us into participation, into bringing others to him that they may find their needs met. That all God's guidance is, ultimately, God leading us and everyone to himself. To put it another way, the final step in discerning God's guidance is this. Every day, In every situation, simply seek to help however you can somebody else with the love of God, and God will show you the way to life for both them and yourself. Don't just go crazy looking for your path. Look at how you can help someone else find their path, and both of you will find your way. You know, there's an ancient legend that is told of a young man who lived some 1,700 years ago who desired to become a perfect Christian, as Christ would have him be, to become a saint. He sought the path to holiness, to perfect communion with God. Thus this young man left his home and family and possessions. He said goodbye to relatives and friends. He gave his money to the poor, and he walked off into the desert to find God. He walked through the desert sands until he found a dark cave. Here, he thought, I will be alone with God. Here, nothing can distract me from the Almighty. He prayed day and night in the dark cave, but God sent him great temptations. He imagined all the good things of earthly life, and he wanted them desperately. However, he was determined to give up everything in order to have God alone. And after many months, the temptations stopped. Saint Anthony of Egypt was at peace, having found nothing but God. But then, according to legend, one day God spoke to him and said, Anthony, leave your cave for a few days and go off to a distant town. Look for the town shoemaker, knock on his door, and stay with him for a while. Anthony was puzzled by God's command, but he obediently left the next morning. He walked all day across the desert sands. By nightfall, he came to the village, found the home of the shoemaker, and knocked on the door. A smiling man opened it. Are you the shoemaker? Anthony asked. Yes, I am, the shoemaker answered. He noticed how tired and hungry his visitor was. Come in, the shoemaker said. You need something to eat and a place to rest. The shoemaker called his wife. They prepared a fine meal for the stranger and gave him a bed to sleep on. Anthony stayed with the shoemaker and his family for 3 days. He asked many questions about their lives, but he didn't tell them much about himself, even though the couple was very curious about his life in the desert. They talked a lot and they became very good friends. Then St. Anthony said goodbye to the shoemaker and to his wife, and he walked back to his cave in the desert, wondering why on earth God had sent him to visit the shoemaker. What was the shoemaker like? God asked him upon his return to the cave. Well, he's a simple man, Anthony began. He has a wife who is going to have a baby. They seem to love each other very much. He has a small shop where he makes shoes. He works very hard. They have a simple house. They give money and food to those who have less than they have. He and his wife have a very strong faith, and they pray daily. They have many friends, and the shoemaker enjoys telling jokes. It was wonderful to be with him. God listened carefully. And then God said, you are probably wondering why I sent you on this trip. Well, you are a very great saint, Anthony, for you have chosen to exclude from your life everything that keeps me from you. But know this, the shoemaker is an even greater saint, because he has chosen to include me in everything he does. Every morning, as he sits to have breakfast, he, without even thinking of it, offers up to me an unspoken prayer, as he is once again captivated by his wife's beauty. He falls in love with her again every morning, you know. And she can tell, and it brings her great joy, and she offers me her own prayers of gratitude. As he then goes about his household chores, things many would complain about, the shoemaker instead gives thanks for all the simple blessings that make his life a little more comfortable, and he tries to help others to see this as well. At work, he recognizes he has a skill that gives him satisfaction and admiration, so he always tries to do his best that he might honor the gift that I give him. But most of all, he is so eager for others to know me as he knows me. He is continually seeking ways to reach out with my love and to help others to me. Either by giving food and shelter to a stranger at his door, or by simply telling a joke to lift another's lagging spirit. You see, Anthony, you have chosen to be rid of everything but me. But the shoemaker has chosen better, to make everything about me. And in helping others find their way, he finds his way. In helping others on to me, he finds me. And with that, St. Anthony's training was complete, for he had discovered the path to true holiness. At times spent in solitude, beside the still waters, but now also in the path of righteousness for his name's sake, caring for the sick, providing for the poor, visiting the imprisoned, and fighting for the oppressed. A great Christian once said, "However far you may ever go in life, none of it is of much use if it is not in the right direction. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Find your way. Discover God's guidance. Let God lead you into life abundant. Put God in front. Respond to those promptings of the Holy Spirit. And remember that God is ultimately leading you and everyone to himself.